Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming out so early on a beautiful morning for this, our spring symposium. My name is David Ware. I have the honor of being the director of the State Archives. The job title says State Historian, which, given the fact that I am not from Arkansas, has always struck me as an example of God having a sense of humor. I'm not sure who the joke is on, but it's a lot of fun. At any rate, the subject today is sports, and I could either burden you with an oversupply of quotes dating back from classical times about man's constant attempts to amuse himself and to prove himself by engaging in things that he doesn't really need to do, but that would be too much like an evening lecture. And the idea today, especially on such a beautiful morning, is to have some fun and to learn something. I will say up front that I'm perhaps the least sports-apt person you could have to come here. I was a failure in high school football under the direction of Coach Frank Solich, who, before he went on to the University of Nebraska coachship, he was a high school coach. I was not a good high school football player. But I grew up enjoying watching sports, particularly baseball. And one of the best things about coming to Little Rock, Arkansas back in 2000 was I discovered there was a pretty darn good AA team at an absolute gem of a ballpark, Ray Winder Field. And so I made a point of, soon after I became the historian of the Capitol building, to do an exhibit on the Travelers as they were coming up on their 100th year. And at that time I had a brand new daughter, and since we couldn't afford daycare at the time, I ended up taking my daughter to Ray Winder Field, rocking her in her car seat on the counter in the Traveler's office. Bill Valentine rocked my daughter, and she carries that memory handed down to her to this day. Baseball is one of the things that makes Little Rock a really great place to live. It's one of the things that made my wife and I decide to not leave here after 3 years and go on to the next job, but to stick it out. And every summer, now I have to go across the river, but there's still reasons to say, yeah, glad I'm here. So we have 4 good speakers, and for those folks who are not here this morning, well, they're going to have to catch it on YouTube at some point, but you're getting it fresh. So thank you for coming out. Make free with the refreshments out there. Remember, the sign says no food or drink. I'm sure there's no coffee cups anywhere in this room, right? Good. Okay. I get to announce the first speaker. First speaker is my friend and colleague, Brian Irby. Brian Irby has a history with the State Archives. He has been on the staff as an archival assistant since 2008. He has a master's degree in history from the University of Central Arkansas, yes, and a master's in library science from the University of North Texas. He's the author of 2 books from Arcadia Press, Pulaski County, Past and Present, and the forthcoming World War II in Arkansas, which will come out in July of 2026. Watch for it. Demand it at your local bookstore. The man's got to make some money somehow. He is currently working on a biography of longtime Conway County Sheriff Marlon Hawkins. And what he has shared with me from his research and his interviews so far makes me look forward to this with much anticipation. Marlon Hawkins is more than a footnote and a joke in Arkansas 20th century political history. A more detailed version of today's talk will be published soon in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly, but you get to hear it with the advantage of hearing the author. So I give you my friend and colleague and fine mandolin player, Brian Irby.
Well, thank you. So this morning I kind of want to take you on a quick journey through a part of Arkansas history that's dramatic and it's surprising and honestly it's pretty entertaining. hopefully you will enjoy this. So it's about the long and tangled fight over legalizing prize fighting. It's a story that's full of moral crusaders, ambitious politicians, and stubborn promoters who just wouldn't let it go. And some of the most famous boxers in world history. And it's a story that tells us a lot about how Arkansas has changed over the years and how they wrestled with questions about morality and masculinity and public entertainment. So now when we think about the idea of the progressive era, that is the era that ran between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, a lot of times we think about some of the larger things like women's suffrage, about prohibition, things like that. But there are other things that kind of were wrapped up in this larger topic of the progressive era. And underneath all this was another fight, one that reformers cared very deeply about, and that was the crusade against prize fighting. And to understand why this mattered so much, we have to start with the distinction that they would have made at the time between prize fighting and boxing. For them, they thought of prize fighting as this thing that were men just hitting each other in the face for money, whereas boxing was this sport that combined athleticism, skill, and things like that. So they drew a very sharp distinction between the two. Prize fighting was violent, it was bloody, and worst of all, it was tied to gambling and money. So these were things that the progressive reformers would have really looked down upon. And so, worst of all, there were ideas that gambling brought the rigging of these fights. So these were not, these were predetermined acts of violence upon two people. And also, it tended to draw what they saw as the worst element of society. They would have these fights in the back rooms of bars and taverns, and all these people, mostly from what they would have considered the lower classes, would come and see these fights happen. One Arkansas newspaper made this point vividly back in 1872 when it reported on a fight north of Little Rock. The Arkansas Gazette wrote about 200 people who attended and called them mostly roughs. They said they seemed to take a lively interest in what the paper called a brutish pastime. And that gives you a sense of what they thought of prize fighting at this time. But as the 19th century wore on, that simple class division between the lower classes coming to see prize fights started to blur, mostly because there were changes that were happening in the sport itself. They invented things like they brought in gloves, so now they were wearing boxing gloves, whereas before they would have been just bare-knuckled fights, you know, in a back room. They did that. They allowed referees to be able to stop a fight if it started to get too dangerous. If it looked like somebody was going to get physically seriously hurt, they would stop the fight. These were some of the reforms that were starting to come in between after 1880, and what this meant was that it became more respectable, more mainstream. People from the middle class were starting to show up at these fights. You had the instance of doctors and lawyers rubbing shoulders with farmers to watch these fights. And that was really a big concern for reformers who thought, well, this is becoming mainstream now. It was a sport that was no longer confined to the lower classes. It was becoming mainstream. Then its corrupting influence, as they called it, might spread to the respectable middle class. And this fear fueled their concern to be able to stamp it out. Women played a large role in this movement. Just as they did for the fight for prohibition, women reformers, feminists, suffragists, church leaders, they all took up the cause against prize fighting. They saw the sport as barbaric and harmful to boys and men, and a threat to the Christian civilization. The Montana Record Herald even predicted that if women ever got the vote, they would vote overwhelmingly against liquor, gambling, and prize fighting. In Arkansas, the Women's Chronicle, which was a newspaper that was published here in Little Rock and was read all across the country, blasted the state's leaders for allowing the sport to continue, calling it a low standard of morality. The Women's Christian Temperance Union went even further. They referred to prize fighting as the first cousin of the saloon, and demanded that newspapers even be banned from reporting fights, which, they were happy to report, the local fight that was going on in their community, and people read those voraciously. And at the same time, reformers were increasingly convinced that only strong laws could stamp this out and prevent the moral decay that came with it. Up to that point, prize fighting was often treated as a matter of personal failing, something distasteful, but not necessarily something that the law should address. But the success of the temperance movement gave them, emboldened reformers. They saw some of the successes that they had in stopping the liquor traffic across the country, and thought that legislation could and should also be used to curb other immoral activities like prize fighting. By 1891, opposition to the sport had been building for decades, mostly through religious channels, and evangelical denominations were becoming more influential in state politics. Because they opposed violent sports across the board, that even included football, which was kind of in its infancy at this time. Southern leaders were also trying to reshape the image of the South away from being from its image that it had gotten during the Civil War. They wanted to stamp out the stereotype of the violent, hot-tempered Southerner, and cracking down on prize fighting would certainly help rehabilitate Southerners' images. So when the Arkansas legislature met in 1891, religious newspapers reminded lawmakers of their duties. The Arkansas Baptist warned that the moral well-being of the state was in their hands. The Arkansas Methodist newspaper said it expected wholesome laws against Sabbath breaking, gambling, and prize fighting. One of the most strongest voices in this fight was Governor James Philip Eagle. Now, Eagle had been a Confederate soldier during the Civil War, but during the war he had experienced a religious conversion and later became a Baptist minister. Now, when he entered politics, he brought his moral convictions with him, and among those moral convictions was that he opposed prize fighting. At the start of his second term in 1891, he urged the legislature to pass a law banning prize fighting, saying, quote, "It is far too frequent that roughs come within our borders to do their brutal work." And the legislature responded. Senator John W. Crawford of Jefferson County, himself the son of a Presbyterian minister, introduced a bill making prize fighting a felony punishable by up to 3 years in prison. The press cheered. The Arkansas Democrat urged newspapers statewide to support the bill, and even scolded lawmakers for not moving fast enough. The Senate passed the bill unanimously. The House debated it and even heard testimony from John L. Sullivan, who at that time was the most famous boxer in the world, who came to Little Rock to testify against the bill. Sullivan drew huge crowds when he came to Little Rock to testify in the committee. But he was not able to sway the lawmakers against their goal of ending prize fighting. The House did introduce 3 amendments, and this is going to become complicated, and I'll sum this up. but it's going to become very important later on. Now, these three amendments included one that reduced the penalty to a misdemeanor and a $100 fine and 6 months in jail. Now, with those changes, the bill passed 17-2 with only William B. Jackson of Logan County and F.G. Taylor of Clay County voting against it. Now, when the bill returned to the Senate, however, the amendments were rejected, and the measure was sent to a conference committee, which then recommended that the House withdraw the amendment that reduced the penalty but accepted the other two amendments. The House agreed and passed the committee's recommendation, but crucially, it did not vote again on the amended bill itself. And this is going to come back to haunt them later on. The Senate accepted the committee report as well, and the bill went on to the governor, who signed it on March 31st, 1891. Now, prize fighting was officially outlawed in the state of Arkansas. And that should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. Prize fighting continued to happen all across the state. Local officials didn't prioritize enforcing the law. After all, they have murders and robberies to take care of. And so prize fighting was not high on their list of things to stop in their communities. Newspapers kept reporting on fights, which probably also exacerbated the issue, and the public kept showing up. By 1893, grand juries had issued numerous indictments for prize fighting in the state, but not one single conviction. Juries simply refused to convict people under such a harsh law. They didn't want to send somebody off to prison for 3 years for prize fighting, something that, you know, they thought was maybe a little, the law was a little too harsh. So in 1893, Representative J.M. McCollum introduced a bill to reduce the penalty to a misdemeanor. Civics groups were outraged. The Osceola Times blamed newspapers for keeping the sport alive and even suggested punishing reporters for reporting on prize fights. Meanwhile, promoters in New York were trying to arrange a major fight between Charlie Mitchell and James Corbett, the only man to have beaten John L. Sullivan in the ring. When New York cracked down, they started looking south. Hot Springs, with its lively prize fighting scene, seemed like the perfect place for a prize fight. Businessman named R.C. Chambers saw an opportunity. He traveled to Chicago and pitched Hot Springs as the venue and proposed building an arena funded by local investors. The city buzzed with excitement, but not everyone was excited. Governor William Meade Fishback initially dodged questions, saying he doubted the fight would even happen. But under pressure from reformers, he changed his tune and said that prize fighting would not happen under his watch. And eventually the prize fighting promoters ended up backing off and the whole thing was tabled. But still, promoters were searching for venues for their fights and kept looking for places. And in 1895, the biggest fight of its era, James Corbett versus Bob Ruby Robert Fitzsimmons, landed in Hot Springs' lap. They had originally organized the fight to take place in Florida, but Florida suddenly also banned prize fighting. The state of Georgia declared that if either of the two fighters were to step their feet within the borders, that they would be immediately arrested. New Orleans, who had been pretty friendly to prize fighting in the past, refused because they had had a fight a few weeks earlier in which someone was killed in the ring. Texas refused. So Hot Springs officials, led by Mayor Woodfin Waters, which is a great name, eager for tourism dollars, offered Whittington Park in the city as a venue for the fight. Governor James Paul Clark newly elected in 1894, was adamant there would be no prize fight in Arkansas, he said. He even threatened to use military force to prevent the fight. He wrote letters to the fighters calling the proposed match, quote, an affront to the sentiment of state pride. Clark tried to keep his words measured, but he didn't hide his position. I do not dare to discuss this matter any further, he said, but I will say, as I've said before, there shall be no prize fight at Hot Springs, and I shall exercise all my authority to prevent the fight, and I have enough power to prevent it. Local ministers also objected. Judge Alexander Duffy ordered the sheriff to stop the fight before it began. He declared that he would organize a militia to keep the fight out of Hot Springs, and said that any citizen of Hot Springs who refused to join the militia would also be arrested himself. Governor Clark consulted the state militia, who said that they could have 850 soldiers ready at a moment's notice. Then things got even more complicated. In order to stop the fight, state law enforcement officials arrested James Corbett for conspiracy to commit assault upon the body of Bob Fitzsimmons. His lawyer challenged the 1891 law. Remember that this would come up again, arguing that it had been passed improperly. The issue centered on procedure. Under Article 5, Section 22 of the Arkansas Constitution, when the House amends a Senate bill, those amendments must be approved by a recorded yea or nay vote. But in 1891, when the Senate asked the House to withdraw one of its amendments, the House agreed without taking that required vote. That meant the bill Governor Eagle signed might have been invalid, and that the 1893 law that amended it would also fall with it. A judge agreed and even ruled that Corbett wasn't planning a prize fight at all, just a, quote, glove contest. The Attorney General appealed, and Arkansas Supreme Court eventually ruled the law valid, but by then the fight had already fallen apart. Corbett had suggested that they put the fight off for another couple of weeks, and Fitzsimmons said, no, I'm ready to go now, and if we don't go now, we never will. So the fight eventually just fell apart, and the match was canceled. Now, they would fight again in 1898 in Carson City, Nevada, in which Fitzsimmons ended up beating Corbett. Governor Clark declared victory, saying prize fighting will not be permitted in this state. And for a while, he was right. By 1898, only Carson City, Nevada, which still allowed sanctioned prize fights. But the sport didn't die. In the early 1900s, this is supposed to be a picture of that fight in 1898. Neither of these guys look like the pictures I've seen, so I'm not really sure if that's the case, but it's still a great picture anyway. By the early 1900s, prize fighting continued quietly across Arkansas. Mayors tried to ban it, governors made speeches about stopping it, but the public still wanted to see it. Governor George Washington Donaghy made it a personal crusade. He wrote letters urging sheriffs to enforce the law. The legislature debated resolutions demanding stricter enforcement. Little Rock even passed its own ban against prize fighting in 1912. But enforcement was spotty. The day after Little Rock passed its ban, police learned of a fight planned in a vacant building here in the city. So when tipped off the fighters, and they slipped away before the officers arrived. Meanwhile, a group of Little Rock sportsmen formed the Rose City Athletic Club to promote clean athletics. They insisted their boxing matches weren't prize fights because no prizes were being awarded. How could you have a prize fight if you're not awarding a prize? They even built a clubhouse in Pulaski Heights. Their first goal was to challenge the new city ordinance against prize fighting and publicized widely that a fight would occur on April 10th, 1912. Their April event turned into a spectacle. Governor Donaghy showed up with the National Guard officials and demanded that the event stop. While the audience was inside to see the fight, Donaghy stayed in a car outside the venue and just waited to see what would happen. Jack White, the club's director, refused to stop the fight. And when the first two fighters touched gloves in the ring, it became clear that this was a mere spectacle to challenge the law. The first two fighters, they showed up. One slapped the glove of the other one and said, "Take that, curse you." Immediately, a constable jumped in the ring, shouting, "Stop, stop, you're under arrest." The fighters in white were hauled off, only to have the charges later dismissed by a judge who praised boxing for promoting, quote, manliness. By the 19-teens, the national mood had been shifting. Theodore Roosevelt championed boxing. States repealed anti-boxing laws. Officials looked the other way. World War I introduced millions of soldiers to boxing as part of their training, and they came home with a new appreciation for the sport. By the 1920s, the progressive movement was also losing steam. Prohibition was unpopular. Americans were embracing physical fitness. Amateur boxing programs at the YMCA were seen as wholesome. And in 1923, Arkansas passed a bill legalizing prize fighting in certain cities and creating a state boxing commission, which still exists today. The bill passed with little fanfare. In fact, when I was looking for the news reporting, I found an article about this big saying that it had been passed. It was simply a non-event. The public had really just moved on. And by the 1940s, boxing matches were being held at community events with government approval. Politicians no longer ran from the sport. And today, while boxing still carries a reputation for violence, it sits comfortably among Arkansas's sporting traditions, no longer a symbol of moral decay, but simply a part of Arkansas's athletic culture. Thank you. And I think we have time for a few questions, if anyone has any questions. Yes?
Define rough.
Rough?
What's a rough?
That would be a brute. Just, if you think about the Popeye cartoons, that would be Brutus, would be a rough.
You know how long that term was around or medical?
I don't.
I've seen it in the Civil War, that's why I was asking.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
Is there a distinction today in today's thinking between boxing and prize fighting?
I don't-
Those terms just kind of merge.
I don't think that people make that distinction anymore. I think they're kind of seen as one and the same. Maybe boxing would be, prize fighting would be maybe a subset of boxing. I'm not sure. Anyone? Yes.
Did things go underground?
Oh, yeah. Well, not so much underground. I mean, it was still done in the open. It's just, after the law was passed, they just didn't ever enforce it. It was probably still a situation where you didn't tell people in church the next Sunday that you went and saw a prize fight, but you still went. Anyone else?